Hello, British literature students. Welcome to this, my video lecture on Charles Dickens's classic novel, Hard Times. Now, what I'm going to do here, because if I were to make everything into one video, it would be a very, very long video. I'm going to break this video up into two parts. And kind of what I'd like for you to do is watch this video before you read the book if you haven't read it already, and then wait until after you've read the book to watch the second video. Because I'm going to have this set up, I'm going to kind of set the scene for you in this video. And then when I talk about the characters in the second video, what's going to end up happening is each of these characters are going to kind of represent one of the themes that Charles Dickens is exploring and throughout this book, Hard Times. So let's just go ahead, and what I also would like for you to do, if you can, is to go ahead and pause this video and open up the slideshow on Charles Dickens if you haven't done so already. If you have, I'm just going to pause for a second to allow people that need to pause and open the video a chance to do so. And if you need to do that, then go ahead and do so, and I'm going to pause right now. Okay, I think that's long enough. All right, so let's talk about Charles Dickens's Hard Times. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slideshow as well. Your first slide, of course, is Charles Dickens's photograph. But let's talk about Dickens himself a little bit. A lot of his life ended up in his novels. So he was born in Portsmouth, England in 1812, which was kind of around the beginning of what would become known as the Industrial Revolution. And this book, Hard Times, is kind of a treatise against the evils of industrialization. Against everything that's wrong with industrialization, because the Industrial Revolution changed the world forever. And I could give you a whole long lecture on what the Industrial Revolution was, and not only the negative effects but also the positive effects, because without industrialization you wouldn't be watching me right now, because there probably wouldn't be any computers manufactured, there probably wouldn't be any YouTube. If you're watching me on your phone, without industrialization there'd be no phone. We'd have to grow our own vegetables. We'd have to slaughter our own pigs if we want bacon. So there was a lot of good that came out of industrialization. But there was also, it was a painful time. And a lot of people died just simply by going to work and trying to earn enough money in order to pay the bills. And sadly, many of those people that died were children. The work was just too hard for the children, and yet they were being pushed past their limits by their bosses. And that's why we now have child labor laws, and that's why we now have safety regulations and such in order to protect the workers from basically being worked to death by their employers. So I would suggest, if you're going to write your research paper on this, to do a little research on what the Industrial Revolution was, because without the Industrial Revolution there would be no Hard Times, the novel. But let's get back to Charles Dickens's biography here. So when he's 12 years old, his father is sent to prison for being in debt. Literally, back in this time, if somebody was in debt, if they could not pay their debts, the person that they owed the money to could throw them in jail, which was called a debtor's prison. And these people would spend their days working while in the prison, while also paying rent to the jailer, because jails back then were not run by the city, they were run by private organizations. So they would send people to these debtors' prisons where they would work all day, usually at hard labor, and then after paying their rent and their board, basically paying for their meals, the rest of the money would then go to the creditor. And the creditor had the right to keep them in prison until that debt was paid off. This happened to Charles Dickens's father when Charles was 12 years old. So Charles, and basically what would happen is if he went to debtor's prison, was the entire family would end up in jail, and everybody in the family would have to work and make enough of a wage in order to pay the debt off. Now Charles was lucky enough not to have to go to jail with his dad, but he did have to go to work in what's known as a blacking factory. And essentially blacking was something used in fireplaces. And he worked in this factory, and this was only about 2 months, but it had an impact on Charles Dickens's life. So during those 2 months, he was a child laborer himself in a factory, trying to pay his father's debt off so that his dad could get out of jail. And eventually, his dad did get enough money to pay off the debt and be released from that jail. But the working conditions in this factory were so horrifying, and the children were treated so badly, that Charles Dickens was inspired by these prisons and the working conditions in the factories. And this appears in a lot of his books. And also Debtor's Prison appears in a lot of his books. Charles Dickens railed against debt for the rest of his life. There's the famous Micawber in the David Copperfield novel. Micawber says, 20 pounds a year income, 19 pounds a year outgo, happiness. 20 pounds a year income, 21 pounds a year outgo, misery. And Micawber was a character that kept trying to dodge debtor's prison and kept trying to dodge the bill collectors. And he ended up having to go to Australia, where a lot of people that were considered, I don't know what the best word for it is, but people who couldn't pay their debts ended up going to Australia because it was kind of a work camp. And it was a way to, not have to go to jail, essentially. So this moment in Charles Dickens' life when he was 12 years old really had an impact on his fiction, and you see it in this book. Eventually, Dickens had to drop out of school again when he was 15 to go work as a reporter in the London court system, particularly what they call Doctors' Commons, which was divorce court, and also the Chancery Courts, which is where wills were fought over. Basically, people tried to fight to get what was coming to them out of the wills. That was in the Chancery Court. And Dickens worked as a clerk in these courts and eventually as a reporter. And this is where Dickens honed his writing skills. This is where he actually became a really good writer. And he learned how to write by writing for these newspapers and writing for these law firms legal documents. And that would eventually end up in his fiction as well. Most famously, the novel Bleak House, which is about a will and the abuses of the Chancery Court. All right, let's see. During his lifetime, Charles Dickens was the most popular fiction writer in all of England, if not in all the world. He would actually write books and then take tours around the world. And he took several tours in the United States even, where he would stand there with a book like this, and he would read from it, and he'd give different voices to his characters. And this was better to some people than actually going to see a play. Of course, there were no movies back then. I truly believe had Charles Dickens lived now, he would probably be a movie director on the caliber of a Steven Spielberg or maybe a George Lucas or a James Cameron. He was that popular. He was just as popular back then as Spielberg and Cameron and Michael Bay and all these other big directors are now. Just as popular as Stephen King is today, and J.K. Rowling and Stephanie Meyer and all those authors. So, he really, really was a celebrity. And he used that to his advantage because, well, we'll get into that in a minute. Actually, he did use it to his advantage in this way, in the next thing on this slide. While his writings were very entertaining and in many ways unforgettable, he created characters you will never forget. He's the one who created Oliver Twist, who said, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" To which the orphanage master said, "More, you say? More? How dare you?" So that is, that's one of Dickens's creations. Charles Dickens, by the way, is the one that wrote A Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghosts of Christmas Past, Present, and Future. That is Charles Dickens. He wrote A Christmas Carol. So if you have not been familiar with Dickens at all in your life, I find it highly unlikely you have not seen some version of A Christmas Carol with the three ghosts. That was Charles Dickens. All right. But despite the popularity of his writings, they also had a very sharp social commentary, a thread of social commentary running through them almost at all times. Now, I've given you a list here on this slide of 5 things. Not all 5 of them appear in Hard Times. But if you read enough Dickens, you will see all 5 of these at some point. Workers' rights, that definitely appears in Hard Times. Slackbridge, the union organizer, is going to try to gather the workers together and unite them so that they can form a union and fight for their rights against Bounderby. In England's education system, that's going to become very apparent from page 1 of this book, that this is a commentary on what is wrong with the England's uh, education system and the way that England was educating its children at the time. And one thing you're going to notice, in fact, this is at the very bottom of the slide, in both of these themes, the reason why I chose Hard Times as our book is because both of these themes are just as relevant today as they were in the past. And we will talk about that in just a moment. In fact, I think that might be the next slide. Let me see. Nope. Okay. So the next slide is Hard Times. What I want you to notice on this is actually a copy of Household Words. This is the way that books were published. So take a moment to look at that. Hit the pause button if you want to, and maybe enlarge that and look at it a little bit more closely. This is how Hard Times was delivered to its reading public from April to August of 1854. Okay, so hopefully you've had enough time to look at that. Let's go to the next slide and talk about this a little bit. Hard Times was published serially in the literary journal Household Words, and you saw that Household Words was at the top of the page, and then Hard Times is below that. The first edition was published in April 1st of 1854, and the final chapters were published on August 12th of 1854. Serial publication was basically the way that almost every novel during the Victorian period was published. And what that meant was the book was released 3 or 4 chapters at a time. Usually there was a page limit. So these authors would have to try and get as much done in, say, 20 pages or 30 pages, whatever the publication had allotted to them, as best they could. And Dickens was an expert at this. Dickens was very, very financially successful as a writer, by the way, and as a publisher of Household Words and his other serial publication magazine as well. But now, of course, Dickens didn't get to keep a lot of that money because his wife had 10 children, but he did, make enough money to take care of those 10 kids and his wife, even after he became estranged from her and left her for an actress. But these things would be released about 3 or 4 chapters at a time every week. So my edition of the book here, this Bantam Classics edition, actually has the date of publication at the top of each page. So you can tell if you have a book similar to mine, and there are other editions I think that have the same thing. You can tell what was going on. And what I would suggest is take a look at where some of these dates change, and look at the cliffhanger that is left at the end of that chapter. So the first 3 chapters, I think, are April the 1st. Let me look through my book and verify that. Yes, the first 3 chapters are April the 1st, and it kind of ends on a cliffhanger. Oh, basically, Gradgrind is arguing with his children about catching them spying in at the circus when the circus is fanciful and not exactly factual. And that'll become apparent to you as you read the book. So what would Bounderby say? Bum, bum, bum. Beginning of chapter 4. We actually, I think, meet Bounderby at the beginning of chapter 4. Yes. We meet Bounderby at the beginning of chapter 4. So we get left with the cliffhanger. Who is Bounderby? First words of chapter 4, this is Bounderby. And we get a big explanation of who he is. If this sounds a lot like a TV program that you've been watching lately, or TV programs you've been watching throughout your entire life, these serial publications were the inspiration for those. So if you watch an episode of, say, 24, and you go through, or you watch episodes of, name your favorite TV show, whatever it is, Big Bang Theory, or CSI, or whatever. Name your favorite television program. Notice how you have a cliffhanger at the end of each week so that you'll turn in next week and see what happens next. These serial publications, the way these novels were published, acted just like a season of your favorite TV program. So, that is, think of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is beautifully done this way. Where at the end of Game of Thrones, there's some kind of a shock. It's like, oh my gosh, we got to tune in next week to see what this means. So I won't ruin this week's episode of Game of Thrones for you if you haven't seen it, but there is a big shock at the end of that particular Game of Thrones that will have you thinking, how are the people of Westeros going to overcome this obstacle? So that's the way that this was published, was serially 3 or 4 chapters at a time. Now, the other thing on here, Dickens published Hard Times as a way to save household words from bankruptcy. So he had this little magazine called Household Words. It wasn't doing so well. Dickens said, well, maybe I'll start publishing it. So he started publishing Household Times on April the 1st. And by the time the book was finished in August, you can see on this slide it said that the circulation of the magazine had increased by somewhere around 500%. So 5 times as many people were reading Hard Times and buying Hard Times at the end of Household Words, 500% more people were buying issues of Household Words by the end of it because they were getting the latest Charles Dickens novel out of it. And so that's the kind of cachet that Dickens had, and he was able to save Household Words for a while. Eventually it did end up going belly up, but not for a while after Hard Times. So he did this as a way to save his little magazine from bankruptcy, and it worked. All right. So while it's very entertaining, you're going to find some very entertaining characters in here. I think you're going to probably fall in love with Sissy Jupe. You're probably going to think what a jerk Bounderby is. Tom Jr. is going to be the whelp. There are some very funny characters in here, but it was really published during his darkest years. Charles Dickens, because he had such a long career, he published his first novel. Actually, he published his first book, Sketches of Boz, when he was in his early 20s. And then, of course, it turned out that, he went from Boz to his real name eventually and started publishing fiction. And he published for so long, he was able to go through certain stages. So in 1854, he's in a dark period in his life. He's got a sour marriage. He's seeing how industrialism is affecting England. He knows that the education system in England is not going the way he wants it to, and he really has a pessimistic outlook on life, and it's clear in this book. So one purpose of the novel is to challenge what he thought was wrong with the education system. The opening words, I will go ahead and open this book to Chapter 1, Book 1, or Book 1, Chapter 1. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. That is key. That is Gradgrind's entire philosophy of education in this book. And Gradgrind, because he was a very wealthy man, was able to open his own school where all these kids would ever learn is fact. Fact, 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 fact. And these students had the facts drilled into them. By facts, he means anything that can be measured with a ruler, weighed on a scale, clarified through observation, anything that can be counted on one's fingers. These are facts, things that can be calculated, measured, weighed, seen, observed. That is all that this education system that Gradgrind is instituting is trying to accomplish. Students were being taught not to appreciate art or anything that could be considered beautiful. So when we meet Sissy Jupe in Chapter 2, she's going to like horses because they're pretty. She's going to like flowers because they're pretty. But Gradgrind is not going to want her to tell him about how pretty horses are, or how pretty flowers are. He wants only facts. Fact, 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 fact. If I can't measure it or weigh it, it's not of any use to me. All right. Fancy. Fancy is the exact opposite of fact. Fancy is emotion. Fancy is an appreciation for the arts. Fancy is imagination. Fancy is, and you'll see it whenever you get to the fact that Sissy Jupe loves the book the Arabian Nights. It is very much a fanciful world in Arabian Nights with genies performing magic, and that is not what Gradgrind wants children to read. Children should only read science books and astronomy and all the hard sciences. That's all that he thinks they should be reading. All right. So we go to the next slide. Here's why I think that this part about the education, that is a thread that runs throughout the entire book, is important. Teaching facts at the expense of the arts is still being discussed in education today. It is still a major discussion that's going on in the discussions of how we should educate children. Today, and I know you've heard this before, most students, as they're coming out of high school and starting to enter college, are being encouraged to major in the STEM fields. STEM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math. Students, and you can see this on the next point, students are actively, I mean, there are people that are telling students, do not major in English, do not major in art, do not major in theater, do not major in anything that won't get you a job in some engineering firm or some accounting firm or some law firm or something like that. So just like Gradgrind in this book said, all of these kids want are facts, do not teach them anything where they have to use their imagination, don't teach them anything about fiction, don't teach them anything about anything they could fancy. Today, students are being encouraged to take STEM fields as majors and take STEM field classes, and to disregard the fine arts and the liberal arts. And, you know, it's almost like we never learn. I mean, I could sit here all day and tell you why you should major in English. I did, and look where I'm at. But I won't waste your time with that. But do know that that is a discussion that's going on. Today, when schools get their funding cuts, the first programs to be cut are usually art programs. So it's usually the art teacher gets fired first. Usually students are told, well, you don't need art anyway, you just need to study math harder. And some schools even cut into students' recess time. They don't allow them to play as long as they were allowed to play, say, 10 years ago. So that is something that schools are really hitting these kids harder and denying them the art classes and denying them the recess. And of course, you've probably heard this before if you've ever watched the news or if you know a teacher. Schools are now teaching to the test. Basically, they are filling students' heads full of facts. So basically, they're putting facts in the students' heads in the hopes that they can regurgitate them on standardized tests. That is what, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and go to the end of chapter 2 in the first book. And I'm going to read this to you. Let's see. Okay, it's not the very end of chapter 2. It is, where's it at? Maybe it's the end of chapter 1. Ah, I was wrong. Okay, it's the very end of chapter 1, the very last paragraph in chapter 1. The speaker, that being Gradgrind, and the schoolmaster, that being a guy by the name of McChoakumchild. McChoakumchild should tell you everything you need to know about that character. All right. And the third grown person present all backed a little and swept with their eyes the inclined plane of little vessels then and there arranged in order. By little vessels then and there arranged in order, they are talking about the children that are seated in the seats. Ready to have imperial gallons of facts poured into them until they were full to the brim. When people teach to the test today, they are filling students' heads full of facts as if the students were vessels, like little water vessels, until they are so full to the brim that they can't help but to get a high score on standardized test. And that's basically about the only skills, many people would argue, that that's about the only skills that kids are being taught today. Just like Gradgrind and McChoakumchild. Then we've got another theme in here. This is a theme that Dickens addresses in Hard Times, is the turmoil that industrialization has brought into England and to most of its residents. And so notice here that all of the wealth is being concentrated in the hands of a few capitalists, while the masses are barely getting paid enough to pay rent and eat. Folks, turn on the news today. There's a lot of discussion about raising the minimum wage. Why do people think that politicians must pass laws to raise the minimum wage? Because bosses will not pay any more than they are required to by law. But there have been studies that say that the current minimum wage is not enough for a person to afford a house or to afford to raise a child on. So this is a discussion that's going on. Meanwhile, the rich are getting richer. The 100% or the 1% are getting very much richer. CEO salaries are like 300 to 500 times what their average employee salaries are. Some people are saying that's just too much. There's no CEO worth 500 times what their average employee is. Whether you agree with those points or whether you disagree with those points, the fact is that this argument that all the wealth being concentrated in the hands of a few is actually detrimental to the health of our country and to the health of our country's economy. Here in hard times, we're having that same discussion with particularly the character of Josiah Bounderby. All right, factories polluting the air and the water supplies. You'll especially see this in the beginning of Chapter 5 of Book 1 of this book. And we're going to talk more about Coketown in a minute. Now what's the discussion? Climate change. People are saying for a long time, well, there's no such thing as climate change. They called it global warming at first. Then they called it global freezing. Now they're calling it climate change because they don't know what to call it. But the fact is that scientific data is proving that the climate on Earth is changing, and that the weather is acting in ways in which it hasn't done. So now the discussion is, well, is this a man-made phenomenon, or does the Earth go through these cycles where this happens naturally, regardless of any intervention of man or of other animals? So that's now the discussion. Do men cause climate change? Guess what? You're going to see a lot of discussion about smoke and pollution and polluted water and stuff in this book. So very relevant today. All right. Resistance of the capitalists to allow Parliament to pass laws to regulate them. In the next slideshow, I'll bring up that point when we talk about Bounderby at the beginning of Book 2 and how he threatens to close every factory that he owns down if laws are passed to regulate the working conditions. Well, guess what? We have a laissez-faire economics idea now, that if government will repeal all the laws that regulate businesses and allow businesses to regulate themselves, that businesses will do what they are supposed to do out of the goodness of their hearts and because it's best for business. The question is there any truth to that or not? That debate is raging on and on and on. So just like Bounderby doesn't want Parliament regulating him, and Gradgrind goes into Parliament in order to help the business interests. We are seeing that on Capitol Hill in the United States today. All right, and that brings me to the next point, the placement of politicians who are very friendly to the wealthy capitalists into Parliament. That is Gradgrind in this book. Take a look at who won the recent elections. A lot of people are CEOs or former CEOs. Here in the state of Georgia, David Perdue beat out Michelle Nunn. Michelle Nunn was a Democrat that was running on a public servant's record, and David Perdue was running on a record of having been the CEO of Dollar General. And David Perdue defeated Michelle Nunn. Mitt Romney gave Barack Obama a run for his money. And look at Mitt Romney's background and his background in business and stuff. After Romney lost that election, he was immediately put on the board of directors for a major corporation. So that's going on today. That's going on in this book as well. And then the need that the workers feel to openly protest their working conditions and demand better wages, safer working conditions, healthier working conditions, and fewer hours. That is going on in the United States right now. People are standing outside of Walmart's and picketing. People are standing outside of McDonald's and picketing. This has been going on and on. The unions have gotten weaker over the last 40 years or so. A lot of it has to do with corruption. But now workers are starting to say, hey, we need to speak up and we need to speak out. And so that's a discussion that's going on today, just like Slackbridge, the union organizer in this book, is trying to organize people in order to unionize them. So then, of course, my final point is, does any of this sound familiar to you in the 21st century? And finally, the last part of this video, before I sign off and send you on to read the book if you haven't done so yet, is to discuss Coketown itself. Coketown is the setting for Hard Times. It is the epitome of an industrial town. It was inspired by England's industrial towns during the 1800s, in particular London, Manchester, and Birmingham. I don't mean Birmingham, Alabama. I mean Birmingham, England. London was the largest town in England at the time. Manchester was, and I think still is, the second largest. So it would be like comparing New York City to Chicago here in the United States. Birmingham is very large also. These are all very industrial towns. Frederick Ingalls who was a German philosopher and good friends with Karl Marx, actually wrote a book called The Great Towns, in which he exposes the horrifying living conditions of people in Manchester. So it's something that if you're interested in, you might want to read. In fact, you might want to do that if you're going to do your research paper on this and cover the living conditions. All right. So Coketown is a dirty, polluted town. You get a lot of this description at the beginning of the 5th chapter of Book 1. You've got the landscape highlighted by chimneys that are belching out serpents of smoke. That word serpents of smoke is not a mistake. They look snake-like, but they're also very deadly. So that's a point that Dickens is making. The red bricks in the town are so covered in soot, they look like they are black. In fact, I think the wording goes, Coketown, actually, let's go to that. That's chapter 5 of book 1. All right, we're talking about Coketown. It was a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. So Coketown soot covering the buildings makes it look like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building full of windows, where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. All right. So, and then a couple of paragraphs down, the first sentence of that paragraph, you saw nothing in Coketown but what was severely workful. So, Coketown is certainly an industrial town. Then, of course, at the beginning of book 2, it talks about how the smoky haze, how the town's so covered in smoke that from a distance you can't even see a town there. You know there's a town there because nothing else could have created all that smoke, but you can't see the skyline of the town. All right, so everything extremely workful. Oh, all the buildings look the same, so you couldn't tell, and this is later in the same chapter, you can't tell the difference between the schoolhouse and the jailhouse and the hospital and the churches and whatever else. They all look the same. Let's see. The monotonous noise we've just read about. The tiny, cramped apartment buildings. This is when we meet Stephen Blackpool at the beginning of chapter 10, or towards the end of chapter 10 in book 1. We see that he lives in a little one-bedroom apartment, that when his crazy wife comes in and wants to sleep in the bed, he has to sleep in a chair, which isn't comfortable. It is nothing like the houses that Bounderby lives in or that Gradgrind lives in, that are roomy and luxurious and have a lot of windows let in sunlight and stuff like that. Very, very narrow streets, very, very filthy streets. Charles Dickens does not talk about this in here, but getting back to the Frederick Ingalls Great Towns, the streets of these industrial towns were so filthy because they were full of human excrement and human urine and horse urine and excrement and dirt. And, I mean, it was very, very muddy to walk on them. And they were narrow. They were so narrow that sometimes it was hard for 2 or 3 people to pass each other on the sidewalks at the same time. So it's very uncomfortable and very crowded because so many people lived in these streets that they are crowded on these tiny streets. So anytime you were walking from one point to another, you were always bumping into someone. All right. So we talked about how the pollution traps the heat within. Again, we're talking about greenhouse gases here. This is, again, apropos to today's discussions about climate change. There's so much smoke in this town that when the heat gets in there, it has nowhere to go. It can't release because the smoke traps it in, making the town much more uncomfortable. And then, despite all their problems, I'm going to go ahead and do this for you, or if you'll turn with me to Book 2, Chapter 2. All right, so let's see. Book 2, Chapter 2. This is when Harthouse meets Bounderby for the first time. And Harthouse turns out to be a bit of a scoundrel. He's a friend of Gradgrind's that he met in Parliament, and he thought that Harthouse and Bounderby would hit it off immediately, which they do. But then, of course, Harthouse is going to take a liking to Louisa and try to ruin her marriage. All right. So this is in Chapter 2 of Book 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. About 8 paragraphs or 9 paragraphs in. This is after James Harthouse has introduced himself to Bounderby. All right, Coketown, sir, said Bounderby, obstinately taking a chair, is not the kind of place you have been accustomed to. Therefore, if you will allow me, or whether you will or will not, for I am a plain man, and we'll talk more about his humility, Josiah Bounderby's false humility in the next presentation. I'll tell you something about it before we go any further. Mr. Harthouse said he would be charmed. Don't be too sure of that, said Bounderby. I don't promise it. First of all, you see our smoke. That's meat and drink to us. It's the healthiest thing in the world in all respects, and particularly for the lungs. So, he paints the smoke as pollution. People breathe in the smoke and they're dying. They're developing asthma. They're dying from poisoning of breathing in all this smoke. But he's saying, this is meat and drink to us. It's the healthiest thing in the world, especially for the lungs. So already, you can see that Josiah Bounderby might have a jaded view of Coketown and the wonders of industrialization. All right, so Harthouse agrees with him. This is, as we go further. All right, so after Harthouse agrees with him, I am glad to hear it, said Bounderby. Now you have heard a lot of talk about the work in our mills. No doubt you have? Good. I'll state the fact of it to you. It is the pleasantest work there is, and it's the lightest work there is, and it's the best paid work there is. More than that, we couldn't improve the mills themselves unless we laid down turkey carpets on the floors, which we're not going to do. All right. The workers would not agree with him that it's easy work and that it's light work and that they're getting paid very well. Not when they're living in a bunch of apartments that are, over shops and live on narrow streets. But Bounderby wants to paint a picture of the happy worker because then it makes him look better. All right. By the way, when he says turkey carpets, he means carpets from the country of Turkey. Turkish carpets were considered luxurious. Lastly, said Bounderby, as to our hens, there's not a hen in this town, sir, man, woman, or child, but has one ultimate object in life. That object is to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. Now they're not a gonna none of them ever be fed on turtle soup and venison with a golden spoon, and now you know the place. So, he has painted a picture of a paradise, an industrial paradise, and says that the people that would complain about it are actually the ones in the wrong. And of course, you can decide for yourself as you read this book whether the people are wrong about Bounderby or not. So that's my introduction. Now, so the story takes place in Coketown. It is an indictment against the problems that the Industrial Revolution are causing. It's also an indictment against the problems of the education system at the time, turning out these little robot children instead of turning out children, which would be a lot nicer. And so I would, if I were you, go ahead and read the book and then watch the second presentation. Second presentation will be about each individual character and the role that each individual character plays and how each individual character in some way addresses themes that are prevalent throughout the book. And with that, I leave you to it, and I really hope you enjoy Hard Times. I think I enjoy it a lot, and I think you will too.